Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Maria Hinojosa. She is an award-winning journalist, NPR radio host, author, and a special correspondent for the acclaimed PBS program Now. Recently, she hosted a one-hour special edition of Now entitled Child Brides, Stolen Lives. Here's a look at the program.
These are the faces of the future. Girls from all over the world who could grow up into productive citizens. But in places where child marriage prevails, they're treated instead like commodities. Bought and sold into marriages they don't choose and aren't ready for. Traditions that are centuries old determine the fate of millions of girls. These are the stories of child brides.
Welcome.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, now it's a fascinating piece that you did, a one-hour special. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you came to tell this story.
There's actually a fascinating story behind it, and one that leads to, at least in this country, what happens when women get into positions of power and then are able to influence the kinds of stories that we end up reporting. When I left CNN and I moved to Now on PBS, I understood that there was going to be a space and an interest for long-form investigative work into women's issues.
Right.
And even though I graduated with a women's studies degree, it's not my beat. That's not necessarily what I'm looking at every day. So I did what any good journalist does. I called up my sources, one of whom used to be a professor at Barnard College when I was at school there.
Okay.
And she was the head of the women's studies department and is now at the International Center for Research on Women. Leslie Kalman. I called her up. I said, listen, let's go out and talk. And I said, what is the biggest untold story about women and girls right now?
Right.
She said, child brides. And I kind of said, really? Because child brides don't sound as horrific as sex slaves or child prostitution or even child labor.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that all of these issues that girls and women suffer, their poverty, their lack of education, health care issues,
mm-hmm.
domestic violence, AIDS, a lot of them begin with the moment she's given as a child as a bride.
Yeah.
So that's how it kind of happened.
And it's interesting because you shoot in India, Niger, Guatemala. How did you choose the countries? Did you try to go to where the problem was most central? How did you do that?
Exactly. I mean, this happens all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
There are children being married off everywhere.
Yeah.
But what we did look at was the highest rates. Niger, out of all of Africa, has the highest rates of child marriage right now. It's also the poorest country in the world. Mm-hmm. India has very high rates, though there are other countries surrounding India that also have problems. But the situation with India is that it's very entrenched. It's been going on for so long that it's a centuries-old tradition there.
Yeah.
Versus in Niger, where the phenomena of marrying them off so young is something more of a modern phenomenon.
Okay.
And then we definitely knew that we wanted to be on the in the Western Hemisphere as well. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes people say, oh my God, the problems are there and they're so far away, off in India and Africa. Well, it's happening here in the United States, probably in Canada in some places.
Sure.
And we found that the highest rates are happening in Guatemala.
And it's interesting too because I know that one of the keys to this entire problem is the idea of education. That women that don't have, girls that don't have access to education often fall victim to this cycle. I was wondering if you could talk about the key of education.
It's central.
Yeah.
What's important to realize is that this is not happening a lot in urban areas, in bigger cities. This really is a situation that is a function of poverty and the lack of education.
Yeah.
But as the international women's movement sees itself, it doesn't think that just because these girls or women are poor and live in small villages that their lives are any less important than girls or women who live in urban areas. Mm-hmm. So in these villages and towns, whether it's in India or in Niger or in Guatemala, there aren't schools that are accessible. Many times for school, maybe there is a school, but you have to pay for the uniform, you have to pay for the books, you have to pay for the pencils. When you're poor, you can't do that. So
Yeah.
the decision is made by a family to educate the boy. And the girl, essentially, if it's not affordable, won't happen. If the school is far away, it won't happen, because there's a sense of, how can we send off our daughter to, you know, walk a mile to school alone? What could happen to her?
Right.
So there's a sense that the girls can't get educated, can't get a job. So the best option many of these parents feel that they have is to marry them off.
Because they're thought of as a liability. And this is also, again, at a very young age. Like, how young are we talking in some of these countries? I mean, it's even before the age of 10.
Yes.
In some.
Yes, and
Yeah.
this was what was really surprising to me.
Yeah.
When I realized, as I was reading in and getting prepared for launching this documentary, in India, they marry the children at 3 and 4 years old.
Wow.
And they marry them to boys who are 6, 7, 8, or 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
The marriage does not really begin until the girls reach puberty. But you know, girls are reaching puberty at younger and younger ages all around the world. So the child wedding that I witnessed, the girls were about, there were 2 of them, maybe 3 or 4 years old, maybe 5 max, but
My
they were
goodness.
tiny.
Yeah. And also coupled with this is the obvious hazard of child pregnancy. And you bring up the phenomenon of fistulas. I was wondering if you could maybe explain that concept, because this is something that most people in the West are not very familiar with.
I remember,
Wow.
to be honest with you, Mark, the very first time I heard about this, a long time ago, this was, you know, probably 5 years ago, it was so shocking that I just thought, oh my God, no one is going to want to hear about this, because it's so horrible what happens. But
Yeah.
the truth of it is that when you're a child giving birth, let's say if you're 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe up until the age of maybe 15 or 16, and you don't have access to health care,
Yeah.
you can go into labor, and you can be in labor for 3 to 5 or 6 days, even a week. So any woman who's experienced that says, that's impossible. How can you be in labor for a week? Well, if you don't have access to health care, that's what happens.
Yeah.
In the process of putting your body through that kind of trauma, and if you're a small girl, you end up essentially destroying parts of your body. And one of the parts of your body that becomes destroyed often is your bladder.
Right.
And a hole is basically created between your, well, it's near your bladder area. And these girls who give birth, often to stillborn babies, become incontinent
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah, because
unless
they
they get a surgery.
Right, which they obviously usually can't afford.
They can't afford, and you
Yeah.
know, if you, as you said, Mark, people in this side of the world don't know about this issue. Well, it's not as if people in Africa or India or that they know about it. If you're from a small village and this happens to your daughter, many people just think this is a sign from God. This is a punishment. We did something wrong. There's not a lot of education out there about these fistulas. So
Yeah.
that's what happens, that they basically separate these girls who then smell. They're constantly leaking urine.
Yeah.
And they separate them and they isolate them, and no one, unless somebody comes to the village and informs them, they won't know that this is a medical condition and that it could, in some cases, be treated.
Right. And it's interesting, though, on the other side of it, I know in Niger you had documented that the Emir is actually making some efforts to try and make some changes. So
Right.
there is some cause for hope. I was wondering if you could talk
There's
about the Emir.
extraordinary cause for hope. I
Yeah.
think that, again, when we first set out looking at this story, I was very concerned that it was going to be such a profoundly depressing story.
Right.
And we all knew that what we want to talk about also is people who are championing change. And the wonderful thing about this as a journalist is that when you start looking at the research and you find out there really are people on the ground, way before we even decided that this was something that we wanted to look at, they were already making grassroots changes. And yes, meeting the Emir of Gobir, an extraordinary man, you know, who has a very humble palace, but he has his guards who are fanning him with peacock feathers all the time. You know, I mean, this
Right.
is the real deal,
Okay.
king, you know, a real kingdom.
Yeah.
And he is very, people listen to him. And because of the fistula, because he saw so many girls in his area of Niger coming down with fistula, this was what motivated him to say, I have to stop these child marriages.
Yeah. You know, the whole time I was watching the piece, I was wondering, it's such a personal piece for you. I was wondering how it has impacted you. How have you changed, perhaps, from, you know, the start of researching this to where you are now? I know you were recently in Europe presenting the special. How has it impacted you?
You know, it's been life-changing. I think, God, there's so many levels, but, you know, first off, I would say the actual knowledge, the concrete knowledge that there are women and organizations out there that are actually taking on these issues and working for change and having an impact on the grassroots.
Yeah.
Huge.
It's inspiring.
Exactly, because
Yeah.
it doesn't become this just like, you know, just names and organizations and numbers. I saw what they're doing.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I realized that my daughter, who's 9 years old, my daughter has cohorts just like her all around the world. Girls who are 9 years old who would love to envision their lives as full of possibility.
Yeah.
And sometimes you think that these are girls who don't have a lot of capacity to imagine or to want or to desire. They do. And I know that there are women across the board who are just like me.
Right.
You know, I don't walk around saying I'm a huge feminist and I'm, you know, this and that. But the fact is that I think any woman who wants to see other women empowered and who wants to see herself empowered, I would consider them a feminist. And I feel like there are feminists all around the world who, if they just had the opportunity,
Yeah.
the resources, would want to change and would want to work for change.
Like somebody like perhaps Mukhtar and Mai, you
Exactly.
know, in Pakistan.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess finally, the final way in which I've changed, and I feel this is very profound, and I've talked a lot with my family about this, is that in this country, we really are living in a moment of extraordinary fear. There's a lot of fear that is created, that is maintained,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of fear about going out into the world, going out into places like Africa, India, Central America.
Yeah.
And the fact is that there's a lot less that we need to be fearful of. And so for me personally, that's been a very important part of the mission.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on kind of the state of affairs for Hispanic Latino journalism. Is this a good time? There's a profusion of new networks. There's Telemundo. I know PBS has a Latino network. Is this an interesting time to be a Latino journalist?
It's a fascinating time to be a Latino journalist.
Yeah.
You're right. There are all sorts of opportunities, things that are opening up, numbers in terms of viewing rates and et cetera that are good. But at the same time, I believe we are living in one of the most divisive times in our country in terms of being a Latino.
Yeah.
There are many leaders in the Latino community who believe that this is not just an anti-immigrant sentiment that we're experiencing in this country. This is an anti-Latino sentiment.
Right.
So the onus that it puts on those of us who have a public persona, who are out there, is huge. I'm saddened to say that I've never received more hate mail
Is that right?
than I have at this time, yeah.
And is it from any particular group?
It's just people who kind of feel like, why do you say your name the way you do? Why do you report on immigration issues? You're an immigrant, you're Mexican.
Wow.
So for me personally, it's been difficult. On the other hand, the urgency that I feel to tell the stories of what it is to be living as a Latino in the United States today is very present. And so,
Yeah.
Sure, I get sad, but I feel like I've redoubled my efforts to speak the truth on this issue.
I was curious what's next for you in terms of projects. Do you have, another perhaps pet project? I don't know if it'll be on the level of something like this, but what's next for you?
I do have several ideas. One of the ones that I'm actually really interested in looking at is looking at adolescent girls in this country, and actually Latina adolescent girls. They have the highest rate of attempted suicide, and growing in the entire nation.
Oh my goodness.
And I think if you kind of peel back what that's about, it has to do with identity issues, it has to do with being or feeling as if they're second-class citizens in this country. So that is kind of one of my pet projects. And the other one I think is looking at women in leadership. There's a change that's happening. Most recently in Argentina with the election of Cristina Fernandez,
That's right.
the Kirchner. Things are changing. And so what I want to know is when women get into power, what really changes. And that's something that I want to investigate a little bit more.
Yeah, and are you optimistic about that? Do you feel that some of these trends are true trends? These aren't just fads, these are things that represent real change?
I do think that they represent real change.
Yeah.
I do. I think that I'm surprised by the number of men who I hear who might appear to be quite traditional, who say, you know, the men have been in power and they just haven't done a good enough job. So let's try and see what happens with women. But whether or not having women in power is the answer, I think, you know, we have to look. And my job as a journalist is to press to find out if, in fact, they're doing better.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.